The accounting, the way Sable had always done it, started with what was certain and worked outward. Certain. 4 children asleep behind him in the outbuilding, 3 under the single blanket the Marin family had left, Rook in the crook of his arm. Certain. The bread was gone, the beans were gone, the half-wheel of cheese the Marin daughter had slipped through the door on Thursday was gone. Certain. The temperature was dropping and the outbuilding's walls were thin. Less certain. Tomorrow. He had been doing this accounting every night for 3 weeks, sitting with the numbers until the numbers told him what the next morning required. The accounting had kept them alive. It had kept him functional, moving forward through the next necessary thing without stopping to feel the full weight of what he was moving through. Because the full weight was not something he could put down and pick back up, and he needed his hands for other things. Tonight the accounting was telling him something it had not told him before. He looked at it from every direction. He checked his arithmetic 3 times with the focused attention of someone who had learned that the arithmetic did not lie, and the arithmetic, tonight, said, the next morning required something that was not in the accounting. It required a mercy that the accounting could not generate from available resources. He had knocked on every door in Harrow's Pass. He had knocked in the first week when the asking still felt like a business arrangement. He had knocked in the second week when the money was gone. He had knocked on the church door and been told the charitable fund had proper channels. He had knocked on the physician's door when Rook stopped talking, and the physician had said it was likely grief, said it through a door opened only as wide as a conversation required. The Marin family, who had given them the outbuilding, were betas with 5 of their own children and a landlord who was already asking questions. They could not do more than they had done. Sable understood this. He held no resentment toward the people who had reached the edge of what was possible for them. He held something else toward the people who had not reached that edge and closed the door anyway. But that was not useful, and Sable had learned a long time ago that the things which were not useful did not get carried. He looked at Rook, asleep against him, the small weight of him, the warmth of a 4-year-old's sleeping heat. He looked at the twins, pressed together under the blanket. He looked at Ren, who was not asleep, who was lying very still with her back to him and breathing with the controlled evenness of a child who had learned that her father needed to believe she was sleeping. He thought about the lodge on the eastern slope. He had thought about it twice before and turned back at the road. The Voss brothers were outsiders, wealthy, not subject to the social architecture that had made every door in this town a negotiation with the town's judgment of who deserved mercy. They had no particular reason to help him, and no particular reason not to. The risk of the 3 miles in the dark with the children was real. The cold was real. He had turned back twice because there had still been other things to try. There were no other things to try. He shifted Rook against his chest and reached across to touch Ren's shoulder. She turned immediately, which meant she had been awake for at least 2 hours. He said, "We're going to walk somewhere tonight. It will be cold and it will be far, and I need you to keep moving no matter what. Can you do that?" Ren looked at him with the gray eyes she had gotten from her father. She said, "Yes." He said, "I need you to help Pell. Idris will be all right, but Pell needs someone to hold on to when he gets tired." Ren looked at Pell and back at Sable. "I know." She sat up. She reached for Idris first. She always reached for Idris first because Idris was the one who did not ask, and she had understood this about her brother before she had words for it. She shook him gently, then Pell, and when Pell started to make a sound, she covered his mouth with her palm and said close to his ear, "Quiet, we're going somewhere. Good, somewhere." Pell's eyes found Sable in the dark. Sable nodded. He had not told them it was good somewhere because he did not know if it was good somewhere. He had told Ren to say it because he understood, with the specific clarity of a person whose arithmetic had finally run out, that the children needed to believe the destination was worth the cold, and he did not know if it was. And Ren had offered the word times, good times, without being asked for it, and he was going to let her have it. He wrapped them in everything available. His coat around his shoulders with Rook against his chest inside it, the single blanket cut into strips and tied around the twins' feet because the shoes had worn through and he had not been able to replace them. Ren's feet were in better shape. She had been careful with her shoes in the way of a child who had observed her father being careful and understood why. They went out into the dark and the cold. The road was a track the supply wagon had made, half filled with snow again. 3 miles felt like more. He counted his steps after the first mile. He talked to Pell when Pell flagged twice about what they would eat when they got there, and the second time about nothing. just the sound of a voice in the dark. Ren did not flag. Idris did not flag. These were facts he held on to. He knocked on the door of the lodge at what must have been very late. The snow still falling, the cold past the point where he had been tracking it and into the point where he was simply inside it. And he had Rook against him and Ren's hand on his sleeve and the twins pressed against his back, and he knocked and he waited. Light appeared under the door, then footsteps, the controlled kind. Then the door opened. The man in the doorway was tall, dark-haired, wearing clothes that suggested he had been awake rather than woken. His eyes moved across Sable and the children with a rapid attention that took in the situation completely before he had said anything. His scent reached Sable immediately, cedar and pine and something colder underneath. The unmistakable layered density of alpha and Sable's omega biology, which had been without suppressants for 3 weeks, registered it with the directness of a thing that had stopped being managed. Sable did not look at this. He filed it and did not look at it. He said, "I know you don't know me. I know I have nothing. But my children haven't eaten properly in 4 days, and I don't know how much colder it's going to get tonight, and I've knocked on every door in town." He said it the way he said things that required precision. Not asking for sympathy, just stating the conditions accurately. "I'm asking you to take them. I can find somewhere else to go. I just need them to be..." The man said, "Stop." He said it quietly, not harshly. The way someone said stop when the thing being said was causing damage. He stepped back from the door. He opened it wider. He said, "All of you, come inside." Sable did not move immediately. His accounting had not prepared him for this answer. His accounting had prepared him for a series of possible answers, some warmer and some colder than what he had received from the town, and he had been ready for the version of this that came with conditions attached, with the weight of obligation that he understood how to navigate. He had not prepared for times all of you. He said, "I'm not asking for myself." The man looked at him. He said, "I know. Come inside anyway." Ren moved first. She did not wait for Sable to decide. She stepped forward past the man in the doorway and into the light and the warmth, pulling Pell with her, and Idris followed, and Sable stood in the snow for a moment longer with Rook against his chest, and the cold he had stopped feeling, starting to be something he could feel again now that the door was open, now that the warmth was reaching him. He came inside. The lodge was large in the way of structures built for utility rather than display high ceilings, exposed beams, a central fireplace that was not currently lit, but that 2 more men were building up now. Efficient and without theater, one on each side of the hearth. More cedar and pine, stronger now that he was inside, the pack scent layered and distinct, and his omega biology was making assessments he was not going to examine until the children were warm. The twins went directly to the fireplace. They stood with their hands out toward the building heat in the way that children went toward warmth, completely, without reservation, the body making its own decision before the mind caught up. Ren stood slightly back, watching the 3 men with the careful, assessing attention she had developed over the past 8 weeks, and Sable could see her running her own version of the accounting. The one who had opened the door, whose name Sable did not yet know, crouched down in front of the twins. He looked at their hands, the reddened skin at the fingertips. He said to one of the men at the fireplace, without raising his voice, "There's the salve in the left cabinet, and bread if there's any left from this morning." The man at the fireplace said, "There's bread times," and was already moving. Sable was still standing in the entryway. Rook had not moved from his position against Sable's chest, but he was looking at the room the first time he had looked at anything new with this quality of attention in weeks. Ren turned to him. She said, "Are you going to make us leave in the morning?" She was asking the man who had opened the door, who was now standing near the fireplace with one of the twins' hands between both of his, warming it. He looked at her. He said, "No." Ren looked at the other 2 men, at the one who had gone for the bread, who was now cutting it at the table with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided what was needed and was doing it. At the 3rd man, who had said nothing at all and was watching Sable with the careful attention of someone building a picture. She turned back to Sable. She said, with the quality of a child releasing something she had been holding for a very long time, "Okay." Sable looked at his daughter. He looked at the twins by the fire, and Rook turning his face toward the warmth and Ren's shoulders dropping from the position they had held since he could not remember when. He thought, "I came here to leave them." He thought, "I am still here." He could not parse these 2 facts into a shape he had been ready for, so he set them aside and attended to what was in front of him, which was bread being placed on the table and Rook beginning, tentatively, to release his grip on Sable's coat. The man who had opened the door was Aldrich. Sable learned their names in the first hour. Aldrich, who had been awake because he did not sleep well in winter. Kale, who had built the fire and now sat watching the children eat with the expression of a man deciding something. And Remy, who had cut the bread, made the tea, and produced a pot of porridge without asking whether porridge was wanted. Sable did not eat. There was not enough for all of them, and he had eaten less than the children for 3 weeks, and this was a habit that had become something structural, a fact about how the arithmetic worked that he no longer examined as a choice. Remy set a plate in front of him. Sable said, "The children." Remy looked at the table and then at Sable with the direct economy of a man who did not repeat himself. "Are eating?" He looked at the plate and then at Sable with the direct economy of someone who did not repeat himself. "You're also eating." Sable looked at the plate. He ate. At some point in the next hour, Rook fell asleep against Sable's arm, which was the first time Rook had fallen asleep without being carried to sleep in 11 days. And this small fact landed somewhere in Sable's chest that he did not have access to at the moment and would not have access to for some time. Kale came and sat across from him. He said, "Tell me what happened." So Sable told him. He told it the way he told things that required precision in order, with the relevant facts included and the irrelevant ones excluded, without editorializing Cord's illness, the physician's fee, the 4 days he spent trying to raise the money before he understood he could not, Cord's death, and the company housing, and the boarding house, and the outbuilding, and the 8 weeks since. Kale listened with the complete attention of someone for whom information was a resource to be gathered carefully. He did not interrupt. He did not offer the expressions of sympathy that Sable had learned to navigate the small performances of feeling that required a reciprocal performance. The times "I'm so sorry," times that wanted, times "thank you," times in return. He simply listened, and when Sable finished, he said, "How long have your suppressants been out?" Sable said, 3 weeks. Kale nodded once, adding the fact to the picture. "All right." He said it in the tone of someone adding a fact to a picture they are building, not in the tone of someone making it into something. Sable noted this and filed it. Aldrich was asleep in the rocking chair by the time Ren surrendered to exhaustion. He had said, without looking up, "The room at the end of the hall has a bed big enough for 4 times, said it to Ren specifically, understanding she was the one who needed to be told. Ren had looked at Sable and Sable had nodded and Ren had taken the twins and gone. Remy set 2 things on the table, a blanket and a cup of water. He said, "The chair by the fire is comfortable, or there's a room off the kitchen." He said it in the tone of someone offering information rather than making a decision, either way. Sable looked at him. He said, "I'll figure out in the morning how to repay." Remy set 2 things on the table, a blanket and a cup of water, and said times, no times, without heat, just the word. He said it without heat, just the word. "Sleep first. The rest is tomorrow." He went to bed. Sable sat alone at the table with Rook asleep against him and the fire crackling down and the snow outside doing what it had been doing all night. He sat with the accounting, which he could not stop running even now, and what the accounting told him was that he had arrived at a door and the door had opened, and that this was a fact he did not have a category for, and that the absence of a category was not the same as the absence of the fact. He moved to the chair by the fire. He did not sleep, but for the first time in 3 weeks, the arithmetic stopped. In the morning, he was awake before anyone. This was not unusual. He had been waking before dawn for months, the body's way of insisting on time to prepare before the day's requirements arrived. He built the fire up because the fire needed building and he knew how to build a fire. He found the kitchen and found what was in it, and began the calculation of what could be made from available materials that would feed 4 children and 3 men and himself. Kale came in first. He moved with the deliberate quiet of someone who had noted that the lodge was differently occupied than it had been yesterday and was adjusting his presence accordingly. He looked at Sable at the stove and at the pan on it and at the table where Sable had already set out what he would need. He sat down. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I need to understand what this is." Sable turned from the stove. He said, "I was going to say the same thing." Something in Kale's expression shifted the fractional recognition of a man who has found, unexpectedly, someone operating in the same register as himself. Sable said, "Whether it's temporary, whether you want payment, whether there are conditions, I need to know what I'm in." Kale looked at him across the table. "It's not temporary." He said it with the directness of someone stating the conclusion of a decision he had made in the night. "There's no payment. The only condition is that you stop treating this like a transaction you're going to have to settle." Sable looked at him. He said, "I don't know how else to treat it." Kale said it without argument, simply, as the accurate observation of a man who had already considered this. "I know." He said it simply, the way someone said a thing they had observed and were not going to argue with. "You can learn." The porridge came to heat. Sable stirred it and thought about the word times, learn times, and what it meant that it had been offered not as a correction but as a statement about the future. Not times you should learn times, but times you can learn, as though the capacity was already present and only the application was in question. He heard the twins before he saw them. Their particular brand of waking was audible, Pell immediately, verbal, Idris a beat behind. The quality of their noise differentiated even from the next room. They appeared in the kitchen doorway together, stopped at the sight of Sable, and then Pell said, "Can we help?" with the directness of a child who had learned that asking was better than waiting. Sable said, "Yes. Set the table." They set the table. Rook appeared next, held by Ren, who had him on her hip with the matter-of-fact competence of a 9-year-old who had been carrying him this way for weeks. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at Kale. She put Rook down on the floor near Sable's feet, where Rook sat and looked around the lodge with the careful, alert attention of a child who had decided to observe before deciding. Rook had not spoken yet this morning. Sable had stopped counting the days since Rook stopped speaking because the count had become a number he could not carry alongside everything else. He watched his youngest son look at the lodge and said nothing. Aldrich came in last, from outside, bringing cold air and the smell of snow. He looked at the table and at the children and at Sable and said, "Good morning times to the room, not to anyone specifically." He hung his coat. He sat down at the far end of the table, the end away from the children, with the careful, spatial awareness of a large man in a space where children were present. Sable set the porridge on the table. Rook looked at the pot. He said, "More." He said it to the pot, not to anyone in particular, just the word. His first word in 11 days, aimed at the possibility of more porridge with the focused simplicity of a 4-year-old who had decided that this specific thing was worth speaking for. Sable set his spoon down. He looked at the table. He looked at his son. He did not cry, which was not because he did not feel the thing that happened in his chest when Rook said times more times he felt it completely, but because the crying was not available to him in the way that things were not available when they would cost something he needed for other purposes. He filled Rook's bowl. Aldrich was looking at the table. He picked up his spoon and began eating with the focused attention of someone who had decided that the appropriate response to a private moment was to have something else to do with his eyes. Sable noted this. He filed it in a place where he put things that required more accounting than he could do right now. The lodge had a particular quality that Sable took 2 days to identify. It was the quality of a space that had been built for purpose but had not been lived in continuously. The functionality of it was intact, the warmth and the structure and the working kitchen, but it carried the slight impersonality of somewhere that knew it was temporary. The triplets had been here 6 weeks, and they had not made it theirs in the way that people made places theirs when they intended to stay. The children made it theirs within 48 hours. The children made it theirs without announcement. Pell's stones arranged on the windowsill. Ren's lesson book at the main table, the table reorganized around a workspace that was specifically hers. Idris, and a particular chair he had not claimed so much as quietly made his. Rook's claim was Aldrich. This was not a decision Rook appeared to have made, it was simply what happened. On the second morning, when Aldrich was standing at the window looking at the mountain, Rook appeared beside him and stood there, and Aldrich shifted slightly to give Rook a better angle, and they stood together looking at the snow for a long time without speaking, which was the mode both of them preferred. Sable watched this from the kitchen. He was doing what he had done since the first morning, working. He reorganized the kitchen stores, mended the curtains, identified the woodpile situation, and communicated it to Kale. The wood was restocked by the end of the week. Remy watched him do all of this with the specific attention of someone who was not watching so much as noticing. On the 4th day, Remy said, the kitchen was already organized. Sable said, it was organized for one person. There are 9 of us now. Remy looked at him. He said, "Are you keeping count of everything you contribute?" Sable said, "I keep count of everything. It's how I function." Remy set down the document he was holding. "I know," he said, with the same quality Kale had used observation without argument. He said this with the same quality Kale had used observation without argument. He turned back to his documents. Sable turned back to the kitchen. He thought about what it meant that 2 different people had said times, "I know" times to him in 2 days. In that specific tone, not the times, "I know" times of someone who was dismissing the thing being said, but the times, "I know" times of someone who had registered it accurately and was sitting with it. He did not know what it meant. He put it in the accounting and moved on. On the 5th evening, Aldrich found him at the window. The children were in bed. The lodge had the particular quiet of a space with sleeping children in it, which was different from ordinary quiet, fuller, somehow warmer at the edges. Sable had been standing at the window for the time it took the fire to drop from its full height to its banking position, watching the snow on the mountain reflect the last light. Aldrich came and stood beside him. He said nothing. Sable said, "You don't sleep well in winter." Aldrich said, "No." He kept looking at the mountain. "This year is worse than some." He said it without making it into something that required response. He looked at the snow. Sable said, "If I'm keeping people awake." Aldrich turned from the window. "You're not." He said it with the easy certainty of someone who had already considered this. "I'm awake before you are. I was awake before you knocked." Sable said, "That's why you were the one who answered." Aldrich said times, yes, times, and looked back at the snow. They stood in the window light. The snow was blue-white in the dark, the mountain patient and enormous above the tree line. Aldrich said, "You don't have to wait for something to go wrong. I've been watching you all week. You're waiting for the condition to become visible." Sable said, "In my experience, something usually does." "Yes, and when it does, you'll handle it. But tonight, nothing's wrong. You can just stand here." He said, looking at the mountain. "That sounds very simple." Aldrich said, "Most true things do." Sable stood at the window a while longer. He was not waiting for something to go wrong. He was simply standing in a warm place while his children slept. Outside, the snow fell. Inside, 9 people breathed. The suppressants were a problem he had been managing with distance. Staying downwind when he could, keeping himself occupied. Remy had noticed on the 2nd day. Sable was certain of this because Remy was a person who noticed everything and gave no indication of having noticed, which was its own kind of indication. Aldrich had noticed on the 3rd day. He had adjusted his behavior in response to it without making it visible, had taken to not appearing behind Sable without some audible signal first, had stopped occupying the doorway when Sable needed to pass through it, had given Sable more space than the lodge strictly required. Sable noticed the adjustments and understood them to be considerate, and felt, alongside the consideration, the discomfort of having his management strategy perceived. Kale said nothing about it, and made no adjustments, which meant either he hadn't noticed, or he had decided the appropriate response was to make no response. Sable suspected the latter. On the 8th day, the town sent a representative. A woman named Hartley from the church committee arrived with the combination of expressed concern and unstated judgment Sable had been receiving since Cord's death. She said the community wanted to be sure the children were properly looked after. She said a widow Omega living in a bachelor lodge raised questions. Sable said, "What questions?" Hartley said the questions were about whether the arrangement was appropriate, whether the children were being properly cared for. Sable said, "The children have eaten every day for 8 days. They have beds and warmth and shoes that were brought from town 2 days ago." He said this in the tone he used for the accounting factual, ordered, without editorializing. "What specifically is the concern?" Hartley said she was sure there was no concern exactly. It was simply that people were talking, and she had come to be sure the situation was understood by the town. Sable said, "The town locked its doors. I understand the town." Hartley's chin went up. She said something about charity having its proper channels. Sable said, "I went through the proper channels. They were closed." He said it without heat, just the fact. "The children are fine. Thank you for coming." Hartley left. Sable stood in the kitchen after the sound of her wagon faded. He thought about the physician's fee. He thought about the 4 days of trying to raise the money before he understood he could not, the way each door he knocked on had been polite and had been a no. He thought about the church's charitable fund and its proper channels and its documentation requirement. He did not pick up any of this. He set it back down, which was the only way to keep moving. Remy appeared in the kitchen doorway. Remy said, "She'll report to the committee. The committee will form an opinion." He said it with the evenness of someone laying out the shape of a problem before offering its dimensions. Sable said, "I know times once for each part of it." He looked at Remy. He said, "The opinion doesn't have the power to change anything here. I want to make sure you understand that." Sable looked at him. He looked at Remy directly. "What does have the power to change it?" Remy said, "You, if you decide to leave." He said it simply, as the accurate description of the only variable. That's the only thing. Sable stood in the kitchen and held this for a moment. He said, "I'm not deciding that." Remy said times, good times, and went back to his documents. He went back to his documents. The second week established its routines. Pell asked questions continuously, the genuine, curious attention of a child who had identified that the world contained more information than he had yet accessed. He asked Remy whether a contract could be broken and, when Remy said yes, followed up with 6 specific hypothetical scenarios. Remy answered each one with complete patience. Sable watched Pell receive this with the focused attention of a child who understood he was being taken seriously. Idris watched. He watched Kale's hands, watched the way Remy's expression changed when a problem resolved itself, watched Aldrich at the window with Rook, and cataloged what he saw. On the 9th day, Idris sat down next to Kale at the table and waited his mode of requesting conversation. After a while, he said, "My father signed a contract for the housing. They made us leave anyway. Was that allowed?" Kale set the document down. "Tell me what you remember about it." Idris told him the shape of the terms, what he had heard his parents discuss. Kale listened completely. "Based on what you've described, no. What happened to your family was not legal. Will anything happen to them? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Idris nodded and went to find his brother. Sable had heard this exchange from the kitchen. He stood at the counter and held the information Kale had just given his son and thought about the housing contract and the eviction and the 8 weeks since, and he thought about what it meant that Kale had said times I intend to find out times to a 6-year-old with the same directness he applied to everything, as though the 6-year-old's question was a question that deserved a real answer and the finding out was already something that was going to happen. He turned back to the kitchen. He thought, come inside anyway. He thought about it differently this time. On the 12th day, Ren came to find him in the woodpile clearing. She stood at the edge of the clearing and watched him before she spoke. "Is this where we're going to live now?" He said. "I don't know yet. I don't want it to be. Rook talks now, every day more." He set the axe down. "I know. I think we should stay." She raised one hand before he could speak. "I know it's not simple. I said you should tell them. You tell us things when they're hard. This is the same." He said, "When did you get to be this way?" "I've always been this way. You just didn't have time to notice." She went back inside. Sable stood in the clearing with the cold air and the snow and the mountain above the tree line and held his daughter's words and thought about what it cost him to let people see what he wanted, which was the thing the accounting had never been designed to calculate. He got sick on the 19th day. It started as tiredness, which he had been attributing since the first week to everything reasonable the weeks before the lodge, the adjustment, the weight of going from emergency arithmetic to something else, but on the 19th day the tiredness was something that had weight and heat to it, something that made the kitchen counter necessary as a resting point between tasks. Aldrich found him there. He did not say anything immediately. He came and stood near Sable in the way he stood near things that required presence rather than intervention. And after a moment he said, "You have a fever." Sable said, "It's nothing." Aldrich moved the pot off the stove. "I didn't say it was something. I said you have a fever." He took the pot Sable had been about to lift off the stove and set it aside. "Go lie down." Sable said, "The children." Aldrich said, with the dry precision of someone citing observed data, "Ren is 9 years old, and she manages 3 children like a seasoned commander. They will be fine for 2 hours." He said it with the dry specificity of someone who had been observing Ren for 12 days. "Go lie down." Sable went. Not because he was told to, he went because the counter was no longer sufficient and the fever had reached the point where the arithmetic was becoming harder to run, and a body that could not run the arithmetic was a liability. He was asleep before he heard anyone in the doorway. He woke some time later, the light was different, afternoon rather than morning, to find Remy in the chair beside the bed. Remy had his documents and was reading them with the focused attention he gave to all work. He did not look up when Sable woke. Sable woke to find Remy in the chair beside the bed, documents in his lap. He said, "You should be working." Remy did not look up. "I am working." Sable said, "You're sitting here." Remy turned a page. "Yes." A pause that had the quality of Remy waiting to see if there was more to the argument. Sable said, "I'm not a job." Remy set down his documents. He looked at Sable with the direct attention he gave to things that required full attention, and he said, "You don't have to earn this." Sable looked at the ceiling. 3 words. The most direct thing that had been said since the door opened, stated plainly, without softening, as a fact about the present rather than a reassurance about the future. He said, "I've been earning things since I was 15. I don't know how to stop." Remy picked up his documents and said, "Times, I know times," with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided about the future. "You'll learn." He said it the way Kale had said it on the first morning, not as a demand or a correction, just as a statement about the future that he intended to be present for. As though the future was already decided and the only question was the pace of it. Sable looked at the ceiling for a while. He said, "Remy." Remy looked up. He said, "Thank you for sitting here." Remy looked up, received this, and went back to his work. "You're welcome." The fever broke the following morning. Sable got up and made breakfast before anyone else was awake, because some habits were older than 19 days. Aldrich came in and found the table set and said, "Times, there's coffee times," in the tone of someone who had decided not to argue about this particular form of self-expression, and poured 2 cups and set one in front of Sable without further comment. Sable drank the coffee. He thought about times you don't have to earn this times, and what it meant that the sentence was still sitting in his chest with the weight of a thing that had arrived and not left. He thought about it the way he thought about Rook saying times more, the way he thought about Ren's times you should tell them times as one of the things accumulating in the set-aside place. The place he had been not looking at for 19 days, that was becoming too full to continue not looking at. He finished his coffee and started the porridge. The twins came in. Then Ren with Rook, who slid immediately off Ren's hip and went to stand at the window, because standing at the window first thing in the morning had become Rook's established routine, and the window was where Aldrich would find him, which was what Rook was waiting for. Aldrich came in. Rook looked out the window and said, "Snow stopped." Aldrich came and stood beside him. So it did. He looked at the sky. Clear day. Good tracking weather. Rook said, "What do we track?" Aldrich looked down at him. "Whatever's been moving. We can go out later if you want." Rook considered this and said, "Times, yes, times," with the focused certainty of a child who had decided. He said it with the focused certainty of a child who had decided, which was, Sable thought, the same energy his son had been using to say times, yes, times to everything in the past week, to meals and stories and questions and small trips into the snow. The word times, yes, times, coming back to Rook's mouth like something he had found again after losing it, and was using now to mark everything that was worth marking. Sable set the porridge on the table. He thought, 19 days. He thought, this is what 19 days looks like. He sat down with his children and the 3 men who had opened the door and ate breakfast in the lodge on the eastern slope while the clear winter sky came in through the windows, and the accounting ran in the back of his mind as it always ran, but what it was accounting for had changed. He did not yet have words for what it was accounting for. He ate his porridge and waited to find them. The physician's name was Dressed. Sable knew this because he had stood at Dressed's door 4 times in the 4 days before Cord died, and because the door had been answered each time by a man with kind eyes and an unalterable policy regarding upfront payment, and because Sable had carried the specific texture of those 4 conversations, the way he carried everything that needed carrying precisely, without putting it down, in the place where things were stored that could not be spent on anything else. He did not know that Remy had gone to see Dressed until he heard his husband's name spoken in the downstairs room. He had been coming down for water, 22 days into the lodge. The kind of middle-of-the-night waking that had been part of the accounting since Cord died, the body insisting on the ledger even in sleep. He heard his own name first, Remy's voice, low and even, saying times the Vane family, then Cord's name, then a pause that had the quality of a decision having been made and communicated. He stood on the stairs. Remy said, "He has agreed to provide medical care to the Vane family at no charge and to extend credit to the families in the Eastern Settlement who cannot afford upfront fees." A pause. He also understands that if anything changes in this arrangement, the Voss Group's interest in the timber acquisition includes several properties in which he has a financial stake. Kale's voice. How did he take it? Remy's voice. He was uncomfortable. He agreed. Aldrich's voice. Did you tell Sable? Remy's voice. No, it's not Sable's to carry. Sable stood on the stairs for a long time. He had stood at Drest's door 4 times in the 4 days before Cord died. He had asked each time if half the fee would do for now. He had come home from the 4th visit to find Cord's breathing change the window closed and understood that the 4 days had been too many. He stood on the stairs and he did not cry, because crying was not available to him in the way that things were not available when the cost was too high. And he held this information that 3 men he had known for 22 days had gone to the physician who did not come for Cord and had made sure this could not happen again to anyone who could not afford the fee. And he held it the way you held things that were too large for the accounting to process immediately. He went back to bed. He lay in the dark and he thought about the word times carry, which Remy had used. It's not Sable's to carry. He had been carrying things since he was old enough to understand that carrying was what kept the accounting solvent, and it had not occurred to him until this moment that the selection of what to carry was a decision someone else could make on his behalf. That someone could look at the inventory of what he was holding and say, "Not this one is ours." In the morning, he went downstairs and found Remy at the table. He said, "I heard." Remy looked up. He said, "I know." Sable sat down across from him. He looked at the table's surface, the grain of it, the marks of use, the cup Remy had been drinking from. He said, he should have faced some kind of consequence before now. Remy said, times yes. Sable said, "It doesn't bring Cord back." Remy looked at him. "No." A pause. The morning light came through the east-facing window in the flat way of winter mornings, even and without warmth. Sable said, "It was the right thing to do." Remy said, "Yes?" Sable looked at him. He said, "I don't know what to do with people who just do the right thing without being asked, without making it about what they'll get for it." Remy looked at him steadily, the direct attention of someone receiving something and not deflecting it. He said, "You'll learn that too." Sable sat with this for a moment. He thought about the word times too, the accumulation of it. You can learn. You'll learn. You'll learn that too. 3 separate statements about the future, delivered at different intervals by different people, each one adding to the ledger of what was apparently going to happen to him in this lodge, regardless of his current capacity for it. He looked at Remy. "Did you do it because of the acquisition? The financial leverage?" Remy said, "The leverage existed. I used it." He said it without apology, just the accurate description of the sequence. It doesn't matter why the result happens, only that it happens. Sable held his gaze. "It matters to me." Remy looked at him. He said, "I know. The answer is both." The leverage was the mechanism. The reason was Cord. He said the name the way someone said a name they had not been given permission to use but understood was the correct word. And you, and the 4 children who are currently eating breakfast upstairs. Sable was quiet. Sable said, "Thank you." Remy received this and went back to his documents. "You're welcome." Sable sat at the table a while longer. He was thinking about the physician and about Cord, and about the way grief and gratitude could occupy the same space without canceling each other, which was something he had not understood before, which he was beginning to understand now. He got up and went to help with breakfast. The timber acquisition closed on a Thursday. Sable knew it was coming. He had been tracking the progress of it the way he tracked everything, not because it was his business to track, but because information was the instrument of the accounting, and the accounting was how he stayed oriented. He had heard the documents discussed at the table. He had seen the correspondence come in, watched Kale and Remy work through the final terms, understood the shape of what was being finalized. He had been running the other accounting simultaneously, the one he had been trying not to run. He had known what it was for at least a week. He had been telling himself he needed more information before he could be certain, which was not how certainty worked. The acquisition closed. That evening, the triplets came home late, and the children were in bed, and Sable was at the table when they came through the door, carrying the last of the documentation in the flat way of men who had finished a significant thing and had not yet decided what to do with the finished feeling. Kale set the signed documents on the side table. Sable said, "Congratulations." Kale set the signed documents on the side table and said, "Times, thank you, times," with the evenness of a man who had not yet decided what to do with the finished feeling. The room had the quality of something that had been approaching and had arrived. Sable said, "You're done here." Kale looked at him. His voice was careful and precise. "The acquisition is done." The distinction was deliberate, and Sable heard it as such. He looked at the three of them, Kale standing near the door with the expression of a man who had arrived at the moment he had been preparing for, Aldrich at the table, present in the way he was always present, available without demanding, Remy standing rather than sitting, which was his mode when he had something to say. Remy said, "We would like to stay." He said it with the same quality he gave to all things that were true plainly, once, without decoration. Sable looked at him. Remy said, "Not because of the acquisition, not because of obligation." He said it in the careful tone of someone removing sources of ambiguity one by one before stating the thing itself. "We would like to stay because we would like to be here. All of it. The lodge, the children, you." A pause that was not hesitation but arrival, the pause of someone who has been building toward a sentence and has found it. "If you want that." The room was quiet in the way that rooms were quiet when something had been said that was going to stay. Sable thought about the knock, about the 3 miles and the door, and times come inside anyway, times the first indication that the question being answered was not the question he thought he was asking. He had been so certain he was not the point, so thoroughly taught that his own survival was separate and lesser, that he had not recognized an answer that included him. He said, "Ren already thinks of this place as home." Aldrich said it with the settled quality of someone confirming a fact they had known for a while. "We know." Sable looked at the table. "Rook won't sleep without you checking on him." Aldrich looked at him with the patient attention of someone who understood where this was going and was waiting for it. He said, "I don't times," and stopped. He looked at the table. He said, "I don't know how to do this. I know how to manage. I know how to hold everything and keep it running. I don't know how to let people in." Kyle moved from the doorway and sat down across from him. He said, with the careful precision of a man stating something he had verified, "We know. We're not asking you to be different. We're asking you to let us be here while you are exactly what you are." Sable looked at the three of them. He thought about the accounting, all the ways he had been cataloging what they gave and trying to find the corresponding column of what he owed, and all the ways it had refused to balance because there was no corresponding column, there was no debt, there had never been a debt. 3 people had opened a door and answered a different question than the one he asked, and had been patient while he caught up to the answer. He said, "All right." He said it the way someone said a thing they meant completely, no qualifier, no condition, just the word, the hardest word, it turned out. Harder than times take my children, which had been its own kind of hard, but this one in the opposite direction, not the hardness of giving something up, but the hardness of taking something in. Aldrich exhaled. Not dramatically, just the release of something that had been held. Kale looked at the table for a moment, then back at Sable, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had made plans for multiple outcomes and had arrived at the preferred one. Remy said, "Good." He sat down, which meant he was done standing, which meant the statement had been delivered and received. The fire in the lodge had burned down to its working level, the patient, low glow of a fire being maintained rather than built. Outside, the mountain was visible through the window, patient and enormous. The same mountain it had been the night Sable walked 3 miles toward it, with nothing. He looked at it. He thought, "I came here to leave my children." He thought, "I am still here." He thought, with the particular accuracy of a person whose accounting had finally found its correct form, "I have been here since Aldrich said times come inside anyway, and neither of us knew it yet." The bond recognition had been present since the first night. The reasons for caution were still the reasons for caution. But caution was different from refusal, and refusal was not what he had said. In the days after the acquisition closed, the cedar and pine scent that had been managing him from a distance became something he stopped managing from a distance. Not entirely, Sable was not built for the complete surrender of a managed thing, but he stopped adding the suppression distance on top of the regular distance, and the regular distance was the ordinary, respectful space between people who were learning each other, and that was what was left. Aldrich noticed within the day. He did not say anything about it. He continued checking on Rook in the evenings, continued standing at the window in the mornings, continued being present in the way he was present, without crowding, without demanding, simply there. But there was a quality to it now that had changed, a warmth to the presence that had always been there but was no longer being routed around. Cale restructured his work around the lodge documents moving to the study. The supply account changed from temporary visitors to residents, the firewood arrangement updated for permanent occupancy. Sable watched all of this and thought, this is what it looks like when someone means it. Remy said nothing directly about what had changed. He continued doing his work at the kitchen table, continued answering Pell's questions with complete patience, continued delivering observations when observations were warranted, and silence when silence was correct. He gave Sable a piece of documentation one morning folded, set beside his coffee without comment. Sable opened it. It was the housing contract from the timber company, the one Cord had signed. Remy had obtained it and annotated it in his precise hand, marking 3 specific clauses and writing in the margin. Breach. Recoverable. Sable looked at the document for a long time. He looked at his husband's signature at the bottom, the signature he had seen 100 times on 100 documents, the quality of Cord's handwriting, which was different from his own, that belonged to a person who was not here anymore to sign things. He folded the document. Then he picked it up again and looked at the annotation in the margin. What does recoverable mean? He said. Remy said, it means the eviction was illegal and the company is liable for the costs incurred as a result. He turned a page. It will take several months to process. The settlement will not be large, but it will be something. Sable set the document down carefully. I didn't ask you to do this. Remy did not look up from his work. I know. Idris asked me to. He came and sat at the table and told me what he remembered about the contract and asked if it had been legal. A pause. I told him I would find out. Sable looked at the folded document in his hands. He thought about his son at the table, 6 years old, delivering his precise account of a contract that had ended his family's housing, and asking a man he had known for 2 weeks whether what happened to them had been allowed. He set the document down. Sable said, thank you. Remy looked up and said, thank Idris. Then, after a beat, but yes. Sable said, I will. He picked up his coffee. I'm thanking you too. Remy looked up. He received this with the same attention he gave everything that required full attention, and nodded once and went back to his documents. Ren told him about the bond. She did not mean to tell him in the way that she had not meant to tell Cale about the town's committee. The information came out in the middle of something else, embedded in a conversation about a different thing, because Ren had not yet developed the adult habit of keeping things in separate containers. She was helping Sable sort the storage room, a task that had been on the accounting for a week, now that the lodge was becoming permanent and permanence required organization, and she said, while handing him a folded canvas, Aldrich smells like home. Sable took the canvas. Sable stopped moving. What did you say? Ren handed him the next canvas without looking up. He smells like home. All 3 of them do, but Aldrich most. She said it with the matter-of-fact quality she gave to observations she considered obvious. It's because of the bond. It's supposed to smell like that when it's right. Sable said carefully, where did you learn about bonds? Ren said, Rook told me. She handed him another canvas. Rook talked to Aldrich about it. Aldrich explained how it works. Sable held the canvas. Sable said, when did Rook talk to Aldrich about bonds? Ren said, last week. He asked why Aldrich smelled good, and Aldrich told him about pack bonds. She considered this. He said it was like a lock and a key, that some sense fit together because they're supposed to. Sable set the canvas on the shelf. He thought about Rook standing at the window every morning. He thought about 4 years old and no suppressants, and the unmanaged honesty of a child's omega biology, which did not have the adult capacity for filing things under things that required more information before they could be understood. He thought about what it meant that his 4-year-old had walked directly up to an alpha and asked why he smelled good, and the alpha had answered him. Sable said, "What did Rook think about the explanation?" Ren said, "He said it made sense." She handed him the last canvas. He said he already knew, he just didn't have the word. Sable arranged the canvases on the shelf. He thought about the set-aside place, everything that had been accumulating there for 28 days, Rook's voice returning, Ren's authority, Idris at the table. "Come inside anyway times and times, you don't have to earn this times and times, all right." The accounting had been telling him this for a week, and he had been choosing not to read it. He closed the storage room. He found Aldrich in the main room, sitting with Rook. The two of them at the low table where Rook had been arranging stones by color, a project that had been ongoing for several days, and that Aldrich participated in with the patient interest of someone who had decided that stone arrangement was a worthwhile activity. Sable came and sat on the floor beside them. Rook did not look up from the stones. He said, in the conversational tone he now used for most things, "Papa, this one is your color." He held up a stone gray-green, smooth, the color of winter lichen. Sable took it. He said, "Is it?" Rook said, "Yes, this one is Aldrich's." He held up a dark gray stone, almost black, and this one is Kale's, a lighter gray. And this one is Remy's, a stone with a pale vein through it. Sable looked at the stones his son had sorted. Sable looked at his son. "You've been thinking about this." Rook said times, yes times, and went back to the arrangement, placing stones with the focused deliberation of a child conducting important work. Aldrich was looking at the stone Rook had designated as his. He held it in his palm and looked at it with an expression that Sable had learned, over 28 days, was Aldrich's expression for things that mattered, the specific stillness of a person who was very present and not performing anything about it. Sable said, "He told me you explained bonds to him." Aldrich turned the stone over in his hand. He asked, "I try to answer the questions I'm asked." Sable said, "What did you tell him?" Aldrich said, that some sense fit together because they're designed to. That when an Omega's biology recognizes a pack's scent as right, it's not a mistake, it's the system working the way it's supposed to. He paused. I told him it was like a key and a lock. His idea, actually. I was trying to find a different metaphor. Sable looked at Aldrich. He said, "You've been waiting." Aldrich held the stone and said times, yes times, without looking up. Sable said, "Since the door?" Aldrich looked at him then. "Since the door," Sable said. "I knew." He said it simply, in the tone he used for the accounting, just the fact. "I knew earlier than I wanted to know. I kept finding reasons to need more information." Aldrich said, "I know." Sable said, "I'm not good at this." Being times he stopped. "I'm not good at letting people close." Aldrich said, "You're better than you think." He said it in the dry way he said things he had observed. "You've been watching us as carefully as we've been watching you. That's not someone who doesn't let people close. That's someone who's very careful about who they choose." Sable looked at the stones Rook had arranged on the low table. The 4 colors, placed in a deliberate row. His son's accounting, translated into stone. He said, looking at the stones, and then at Aldrich, "I'm choosing." Aldrich said times I know times with the quiet certainty of someone for whom this had already been true for a while. They sat on the floor of the main room with Rook between them while Rook arranged his stones and the fire went on burning and outside the mountain held its patient winter position. It went slowly, which was how it was supposed to go. The bond recognition had been present and was now named, which changed the quality of the days without changing the structure of them. The children still ate breakfast. The work still got done. The twins still followed Kale into the snow to learn about tracking and the trees and the particular logic of a mountain winter. Ren still conducted her lessons at the kitchen table with the focused authority of someone who understood that learning was a resource. Rook still stood at the window every morning to deliver his snow report to Aldrich. What changed was the distance gradually, and then entirely, by accumulation, Aldrich's hand on Sable's shoulder, brief and deliberate. Kal in the evenings, in comfortable silence. Remy's coffee at his elbow, which had always happened but now carried the weight of being known rather than provision. Sable was known. This was the hardest fact to accept. Known meant the order of his morning. Known meant the right quality of silence. Known meant the way Ren looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching the same way he looked at the triplets, and which meant the same thing in both of them. He was in the kitchen one evening when Kale came in from outside, brushing snow from his coat. The twins had already been sent to bed, still arguing about which of them had spotted the fox track first. Rook was asleep. Ren was finishing a letter she was writing to no one specific, which was how she worked through things and would be in bed within the hour. Kale poured himself water at the counter and stood beside Sable, not close enough to crowd, close enough to be there. Kale came to stand beside him and said, without preamble, "How are you?" Sable said, "Time's all right," times without thinking, and then registered what the word meant and felt the wryness of a person hearing their own language used back at them. He looked at Kyle. Actually all right. Not the other kind. Kale looked at him. His expression held the thing it had been holding for a while now, the thing that was not new but was more visible, something warm and careful and entirely real. Kale said it with the directness of someone who had been paying attention. "I know the difference." Sable said, "I know you do." They stood at the counter in the kitchen while the snow came down outside. Sable said, "I have been thinking about what you said, about letting you be here while I am what I am." He said it in the careful way he said things that required accuracy. "I've been what I am for a long time without anyone wanting to be here for it. I don't know how to trust that it won't, that the thing that makes people want to be here won't eventually be the thing that makes them leave." Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The thing that made us want to be here is that you gave your last meal to 3 strangers and then asked them to save your children instead of yourself." He said it plainly, with the specific economy of a man who did not say more than the thing required. That is not something that goes away. That is not contingent on what you do next or what you fail at or what difficult thing the accounting turns up. That is who you are. A pause. We have been watching who you are for 30 days. We know what we chose. Sable looked at the counter. Sable said, "I walked 3 miles in the snow." Kyle said times yes, waiting. Sable said, "I didn't think I was doing something remarkable. I just didn't have another option." Kyle said, "Most remarkable things are done by people who didn't think they had another option." He said it without making it into something large. That doesn't make them less remarkable. It makes them more. Sable was quiet for a long time. Sable said, "You know Cord's name." Kale said, times yes, simply. Sable said, "Remy used it the other day, like it was allowed." Kale said, "It is allowed. He was your husband. He is your children's father." He said it with the simple directness of someone drawing a clear line. He doesn't disappear because we're here. Sable set down what he had been holding at the counter. He turned to Kale. He said, "I want to stay." He said it with the same plainness Remy used for true things without decoration, once, as a statement about the present rather than a negotiation. "I want this, all of it. I want the children to have this." He held Kale's gaze. "I want me to have this." Kale looked at him. The expression on his face was the one Sable had been learning for 30 days, the controlled warmth of a man who was very careful and was not being careful right now, or was being careful in a different way. The way of someone who had decided that the care was in being fully present rather than in containing himself. He said, "Then it's yours." He said it with the certainty of someone who had been waiting to say it. The bond recognition that had been present since the door opened, that had been building through every morning and every evening and every session of stones and snow reports, and times you don't have to earn this, times it's settled. Not with ceremony, not with declaration. It settled the way the lodge had settled, the way the children had settled, the way things settled when the right conditions were finally present and the only remaining question was allowing them to be. The marking happened over 3 separate evenings, one at a time, each its own. Kale first, precise and intentional. Aldrich the following evening, carrying the warmth of times, come inside anyway. 30 days of presence without demanding. Remy last, who sat across from Sable and said, before anything else, "I want to make sure you're certain. Not because I doubt you, because certainty matters." Sable said, "I'm certain." Remy said, "Time's good," and that was the extent of the verification required. The bond completed not what Sable had expected. Not the warmth of it, not the way the three presences settled into something that felt less like an addition than a correction. Like the accounting had been running slightly off balance for years, and now the missing entry was entered and the books were right. He thought about Cord, a love that was its own kind, complete and finished, its own shape. He did not feel guilty. He could carry everything Cord had been, in the place where things were stored that could not be spent, and it did not take away from what was here. Outside, snow was falling. Spring came slowly, in the way spring came to mountain towns tentatively at first. A day of warmth followed by 3 more cold ones, then 2 warm days, then a week of mud and genuine green, beginning at the edges of things. The lodge had changed with the season. The storage room that Sable and Ren had sorted in February was now a workroom, Ren's maps and documents arranged with her characteristic system, a low shelf installed by Kale at a height accessible to Ren and Idris, a chair that was Idris's in the way that things became his. The main room had a low table permanently occupied by Rook's stone arrangements, which had expanded in scope and complexity as winter became spring and Rook became 5 years old and his taxonomy of the lodge's world became more elaborate. Pell had built something in the east corner. Sable was not entirely sure what it was. It had been described at various times as a bridge, a fort, an observatory, and a machine for catching birds. Whatever it was, it grew weakly, and no one had suggested taking it down. On a morning in late March, Idris appeared and sat across from Sable, folding his hands, something he had learned from Remy, and said, "Are we staying here forever?" "I think so. Is that all right?" "Yes." He looked at his hands. "Pell told me bonded Omegas usually have more children. Rook wants a sister. It's something I'd need to decide with them. But yes, I think I would want to." Idris nodded. At the doorway, "I think Papa Cord would have liked them." He went to find his brother. Sable stayed at the kitchen table for a while. He thought about Cord's name in his son's mouth, times Papa Cord, the designation the children had arrived at on their own, the way children arrived at the things that needed arriving at. He thought about the quality of that name, the way it preserved what it needed to preserve while making room for what was here. He heard the twins in the yard, their voices distinguishable now by their particular cadences, Pell asking something at volume, Idris answering at slightly less volume. He heard Rook at the window in the main room, delivering a report to Aldrich about a bird he had identified. He heard Kale's footsteps on the stairs and Remy's voice from the study, a brief exchange with Ren about something legal that she had apparently asked about. He sat in the kitchen with all of it surrounding him, the sounds of the lodge inhabited, which were different from the sounds of a lodge used, and different again from the sounds of an emergency shelter, and he thought about the night he had walked 3 miles through the snow and asked for a mercy he did not believe. Included him. He thought, "I asked them to take my children." He thought, "They took everything." He thought this without the weight it had carried in the first days, not as a loss of something, but as the correct form of what had happened, the thing seen clearly from the distance of months. He had arrived at that door with nothing, and the door had opened, and everything had followed from that the way everything followed from a single accurate assessment. Come inside anyway. The twins came in from the yard, cold-cheeked and arguing. Rook came from the window to investigate the argument. Ren appeared from the study to adjudicate it, which she did in the brief, authoritative manner of someone who considered adjudication part of her responsibilities. Aldrich came through the door behind the twins, stamping snow from his boots. He looked at Sable at the table. Aldrich sat down across from him. "What are you thinking about?" Sable said, "The accounting." Aldrich said, "What does it say?" Sable looked at his children and the man in the doorway and the kitchen of the lodge that was theirs, his and the children's and the triplets, in the way that things became all of these at once when they were true. He said, "It says we're all right." Aldrich came and sat down across from him. Aldrich said, with the dry recognition of a man who knew the reference, "All right, all right." Sable said, "The best kind." The following winter, the first hard snow came on a day in early November. Sable watched it from the kitchen window, the first snow carrying something different from the snows that followed it, the particular quality of a season announcing itself. The mountain above the tree line had gone white above the tree line already, and now the white was descending, and by morning the yard would be covered. Rook appeared at the window beside him. He looked at the snow coming down with the focused attention he gave to all weather events. He said, "First one." Sable said, "Yes." Rook pressed his hand against the cold glass. Last year, it came later. Sable said, I know. You measured. Rook said, I'm measuring this year too. He pressed his hand against the cold glass. Aldrich says, if we get a lot early, the spring will be good. Sable looked at his son. What do you think? Rook considered this with the seriousness he brought to all questions about snow. He said, I think he's right. He knows things about mountains. Sable smiled. It was the smile that had become his natural expression in this kitchen, at this window, with this child not performed, not managed, just the face he made when the accounting told him something true. The twins came in from outside, snow on their coats, already reporting. Idris had been tracking something, which he described in the careful sequence of his observations. Pell had found something interesting and was reporting it at volume. Ren appeared from the study to hear the report, asked 3 questions, and rendered a verdict. This was how every outdoor expedition concluded. Kale came in behind them, carrying wood for the evening, and set it by the stove and began building up the fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this every winter evening for a year now and had developed his system. Remy came from the study with the particular expression of a man who has finished a satisfying piece of work and is ready to be in the room with other people. Aldrich came in last, shaking snow from his coat, and came to stand beside Rook at the window. Rook delivered his report when Aldrich came to the window. 9 inches so far. Aldrich looked at the sky. Give it another hour. Rook nodded with the authority of someone who had spent a year learning to read it. Sable looked at the room. The bread was in the oven, the fire was building, the twins were still reporting. Ren was calculating something on a piece of paper that Idris had handed her. Rook was at the window. The 3 men who had opened a door in the middle of the night were distributed through the kitchen and the study and the fire with the ease of people who had stopped performing habitation and had simply inhabited. He thought about the knock not with the weight it had carried in the first weeks, but with the clarity of distance. He had stood at that door with nothing and asked for a mercy he did not believe extended to himself. He had thought the question was, take my children. The answer had been, all of you, come inside anyway. It meant you are not a separate question from your children. It meant the life was the point. It meant times, all right, times, said finally in a lodge on a mountain and meant completely. The bread came out of the oven. The table filled. Rook climbed into Aldrich's lap and reported that the snow had reached 11 inches, which was more than last year's first snow, which he had measured and recorded in the notebook Remy had given him for exactly this purpose. Aldrich said, good eye. Rook said, I know. He said it with the settled confidence of a child who had found his footing in the world, who knew what he knew who was at the table with him, who knew the sounds of the lodge and the names of the birds and the color of the stones and the smell of the people who were his. Sable cut the bread. He passed the first piece to Ren, who took it without looking up from her calculations. He passed the second to Pell, who received it with the grateful immediacy of someone who had been waiting for bread since the expedition ended. He passed the third to Idris, who nodded in the way of someone acknowledging a fact. Kale poured water. Remy closed his documents. Aldrich kept one arm around Rook and used the other to reach for the bread with the easy domesticity of a man who had stopped being careful about reaching. The snow went on falling outside. Inside, the accounting ran the way it always ran, the list of what was certain, working outward. Certain, 4 children at this table. Certain, 3 men. The fire, the bread. Certain, the mountain outside, patient in its winter. The same mountain it had been the night Sable walked toward it with nothing. Everything else had followed from the door opening. From times come inside anyway. From times all right. The accounting knew how to balance now. It had the right entries. It said, this is what enough looks like. It said, this is what home is.